Hello, everyone, and welcome today. My name is Wycliffe Shreve. I'm a reference librarian and lecturing fellow here at Duke. And on behalf of the Goodson Law Library and the Office of the Dean, we're pleased to welcome you to our faculty celebration for Professor Matt Adler and his new book, The Oxford Handbook of Wellbeing and Public Policy. As a former resident of New Orleans, I would also like to wish everyone here a happy Mardi Gras. One of the most common New Orleanian expressions for this time of year is laissez le bon temps rouler, or let the good times roll. These expressions represent perhaps the most fitting theme for the focus of Professor Adler's new work. At Duke Law, we are lucky to have so many distinguished scholars on our faculty. While we celebrate each new contribution to the landscape of legal scholarship, we try to highlight several book publications each year. Before I introduce Professor Adler, a few important thank yous. We'd like to thank the Dean's Office and Guy Uriel Charles, Edward and Ellen Marie Schwartzman Professor of Law and Senior Associate Dean for Faculty and Research for co-sponsoring these celebrations, as well as Interim Director of the Goodson Law Library, Melanie Dunshee, and Acting Interim Director, Jennifer Behrens. We'd also like to thank Media Services, the Events Office, and Sue Hicks for all their work to make sure that these events proceed smoothly. We'd like to thank Cafe De Novo for providing lunch. And finally, we, of course, would like to thank all of you for being here today. Matt Adler joined the law school faculty in 2012 as the Richard A. Horvitz Professor of Law. His scholarship has historically integrated law, welfare economics, and moral philosophy to study policy, risk regulation, and constitutional theory. He teaches in the areas of constitutional law, administrative law, and the rule of law. He has authored or co-authored over 50 articles and book chapters and has authored, co-authored, and edited 5 books, work that has spanned over 3 decades. The work we're here to celebrate today, the Oxford Handbook of Wellbeing and Public Policy, is a comprehensive interdisciplinary treatment of what constitutes well-being, drawing from welfare economics, moral philosophy, and psychology. It covers empirical methods of policy assessment, conceptions of well-being, and discusses what are the best or most appropriate methods for measuring what well-being actually is. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Matt Adler.
Thank you so much, Wick, Jennifer, Melanie, the Dean's Office, for organizing this, and thank you all for coming. Thank you for the generous introduction. Okay, so I'll tell you a little bit about the handbook. There's the basic facts before we get into the content in greater detail. I co-edited it with Marc Fleurbaey, who's a welfare economist at Princeton. The aim is to provide a systematic overview both of methodologies for assessing governmental policy and evaluating social condition in light of individual well-being, as well as the philosophical underpinnings of the different approaches. It's a big book. It's a big book. I hurt my arm carrying it around. It's 30 chapters, 963 pages. Not that that's the metric of quality, but it is big, at least in the physical size sense. It does make a mean paperweight, 38 authors. So what was the editor's job? And I was very privileged to be able to co-edit this with Marc, who's really a great person and scholar. We came up with the overall structure of the handbook. We proposed it to Oxford University Press. I guess this is, it's a truism that you always find what you're looking for in the last place you look, but we sent it to a bunch of other presses and they were not interested. And we said, well, let's try one more time, and we were lucky to get OUP interested. We then recruited the authors for different specific chapters. So it's not an anthology. We went around and found specific authors to fill the different niches. I'll show you the table of contents in a second. It's often said that trying to organize academics is like herding cats, a lot harder than herding dogs or sheep. So we had to herd this team of very capable cats. And then we wrote our own chapters plus an introduction. The authors are economists, law professors, philosophers, and, well, I have their psychologists. I guess I should say professors of psychology. But in any event, an interdisciplinary group of scholars from a lot of different places, universities in Alicante, Antwerp, Bari, Birmingham, Cergy-Pontoise, CNRS, which is the French National Research Institute, Columbia, Duke, Glasgow, Caledonian, Indian Cisco Institute, Queens in Canada, Laval, Louvain, I'm testing my French here, LSE, Maryland, Michigan State, Murcia, Nevada, OECD, Oxford, the Paris School of Economics, Princeton, Rochester, Queensland, St. Louis, Stockholm, Toronto, UCSD, Vanderbilt, the World Bank, and Yale. So I wouldn't say that we are globally representative, but certainly inclusive not just of US scholars, but also European and UK, and some other places as well. All right, so here's the table of contents, and in a moment I'll highlight some themes and talk about this stuff in greater detail, but just to see what we covered, introduction, and then 4 parts. Right, so what's the structure here? So first we cover methods of policy assessment. Right, and the idea is to have chapters covering all the different systematic methods for assessing governmental policy that have been developed in the academic literature. Now, some of these are also very widely used in government. So, for example, GDP, cost-benefit analysis, QALYs, that's a measure of health and longevity. So quality-based cost-effectiveness analysis is used in the UK in making public health decisions. Some of these are not used in government, but are important and well-developed in the scholarly literature and often used in public discussion. So, for example, inequality metrics, when one hears about the Gini coefficient, right, or the Atkinson index, or the coefficient of variation, that's a type of inequality measure. Or poverty, right, when one hears not just about the headcount ratio, but a sort of more sophisticated poverty metrics, that's based on this literature on poverty measures, social welfare functions, fair allocation, social ordering functions, multidimensional indicators, happiness-based policy analysis. We think that's it. There may be something else out there, but in terms of kind of systematic policy tools, part 1 sort of covers the map. Then we talk about part 2 covers different philosophical conceptions of well-being. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a second, but basically there are 3 main philosophical schools, right, regarding the nature of well-being. So preference-based views, mental state approaches, and objective good views of well-being. So we have chapters covering each of those, and then we talk about the burgeoning literatures on subjective well-being, a kind of mental state view, both in psychology and in economics. And I'm going to come back in a minute and say a little more about that. So having sort of laid out all the different ways to think about policy assessment in part 1 and the underlying conceptions of individual well-being, we then really drill down on the question of measurement. Right? Because at the end of the day, the ambition here is to measure well-being so that we can think about policy choice in light of well-being. And chapter 3 does 2 things. One is to talk about different measurement approaches corresponding to the different philosophical conceptions. And again, I'll talk about this. But for example, equivalent income and extended preferences are both sort of preference-based measures of well-being. SWB is a mental state type happiness-based measure of well-being. We also, in chapter 3, talk about the choice between a kind of multidimensional approach to policy analysis and an approach that's based on a well-being measure. And again, I'm going to say something about that in a minute. And then finally, part 4, we don't want to feel like we've solved all the problems here. There are sort of pervasive problems or difficulties that anyone who wants to use a systematic policy tool has got to grapple with. And chapter 4 has separate chapters going over that. So, for example, how do we evaluate policy under conditions of risk, right, where we don't know exactly what the outcome of policy is going to be. We might not even be able to assign probabilities, right? How do we adjust policy choice to take account of individual responsibility, right? It might seem that we want to differentiate between someone who is at a given well-being level through bad luck and someone who is at that level because he or she has made poor choices. How do we do that systematically if we want to do that? How do we take account of heterogeneous prices and preferences, right? So I got a certain income amount, you got a certain income amount, but the benefit of that to me depends, first of all, on the market prices, right? And to compare my well-being with yours, we have to take account of the different prices we might be facing, as well as our preferences. So this becomes quite complicated. We're all used to sort of inflation adjustment, but underlying the whole practice of inflation adjustment or price adjustment is a whole theory of taking account of heterogeneous prices and preferences. Often we have data on a household level, right? Household income. But the household is not a single unit. There are people in the household, right? So how do we sort of estimate the well-being of the members of the household given just household level data about, you know, house size, household income, and so forth. Preference inconsistency. I mean, one of the ways in which the handbook actually could be even longer, we could have, you know, gone over 1,000 pages, is through bigger coverage of so-called behavioral economics, right? This whole huge field about how people have kind of irrational preferences. So we don't have multiple chapters on that, but that is covered in this one chapter on preference and consistency. Lifetime well-being, right? In principle, it would be nice to measure well-being over a whole lifetime, right? People exist over a lifetime, and so in principle, we want to take account of lifetime well-being. That poses some challenges, right? One, what, you know, sort of philosophically is the structure of lifetime well-being? Is it just additive? Are there more complicated interaction effects between periods? And as a matter of estimation, you know, how do we figure that out? And finally, future generations, right? Climate change, other policies involve trade-offs between the well-being of the current generation and the well-being of future generations. How should we think about that? Okay, so that's the table of contents. There's a lot in here, but let me just highlight some of the main themes, and I'll try not to go too long because I would love to have time for Q&A. The themes I want to highlight that run through the handbook are, and there are others, but I'm going to focus on these, beyond GDP and beyond CBA, right? Beyond gross domestic product and beyond cost-benefit analysis. Second, this notion of the social welfare function, right? If that sounds weird, don't worry. I'll explain it in a minute. This is, as I'm going to say, sort of a pervasive theme of the handbook. The different accounts of well-being that I mentioned going over the table of contents, right? The sort of debate about these and the debate about their associated measures is one of the pervasive themes of the handbook. And finally, I love acronyms, IMWB, right? Don't think this acronym existed before this handbook. Maybe it shouldn't. Inclusive measure of well-being, right? So policy assessment based upon an inclusive measure of well-being, IMWB-based policy assessment versus the multidimensional approach. That, I'm sure, is totally obscure, but as I'll explain in a little bit, that too is one of the themes of the handbook. Okay. Let me just say something about beyond GDP and beyond CBA. These are, respectively, the headline measures of societal condition, how a country is doing, and policy assessment. I mean, we see them all the time, right, in the news. They're used in government. You know, the U.S. government, many other governments have whole statistical departments in the government geared up to calculate and report GDP, right? Cost-benefit analysis. Cost-benefit analysis is a pervasive part of policy assessment in the U.S. government and various other governments as well. GDP is, again, the headline measure of societal condition, how a society is doing at a given time. As you learned if you took macroeconomics, GDP, more precisely, is the value at market prices of final marketed goods and services produced in a country during a year. That is GDP, right? We have a whole system of national accounts set up to calculate that, as do many other countries. So that is a quantification both of national output, right? The output of marketed goods and services, which in turn are going to be used either for consumption by households or for investment, right? So, you know, I buy a sandwich, that's consumption, right? Facebook buys a server, that's investment, right? So these are two things that are important for well-being. At the same time, right, GDP is not just a measure of output, but it's a measure of income, right? So the income from the sale of goods and services flows to individuals as wages or as return on capital. So it's obviously, you know, in a rough sense, an important sense, a measure of how a country is doing during a given year, but it's also limited in various ways, right? It ignores non-market sources of well-being, and there are a lot of them, right? Health, longevity, environmental condition, social cohesion, happiness, et cetera, except as reflected in market transactions, right? So if I buy a blood pressure monitor, that counts as the purchase of a consumption good. If I go out and exercise to improve my blood pressure, that has no effect on measured GDP, right? If I hire someone to provide childcare, that counts as a consumption of a service, right? If I provide childcare myself, zero effect on GDP, right? So it just looks at all these different inputs to well-being as reflected in market transactions, right? This is what economists call the production boundary, right? Stuff which is not in the production boundary, which is not marketed, doesn't enter into GDP. GDP also ignores the distribution of income, right? Again, GDP measures total income that flows to people in the form of interest, dividend, right, return on capital or wages, but ignores distribution, right? Does that accrue just to people at the top, at the bottom? What's the distribution of that? Again, completely ignored in GDP. Well, GDP is a measure of societal condition, right? How a society is doing in a given year. Cost-benefit analysis is the leading tool for policy assessment, right? For deciding, you know, whether a policy is a good policy relative to the status quo or relative to some other policy. In the U.S., it was put in place for regulatory choices by President Reagan, and it's remained in place since. Right? Every president has tweaked it. Trump has preserved it and added some further requirements, but basically remained in place for a long time. As my Adler students know, I love to talk about cost-benefit analysis. I'm going to not, you know, I will try to suppress that here. But what's cost-benefit analysis? Cost-benefit analysis assigns a value to each policy equaling the sum of monetary equivalents, right? So for each person or each group of people, we can quantify the policy effect on them, right, positive or negative, in terms of a monetary equivalent, how much they're willing to pay or accept relative to the status quo. Now, it's important to understand that non-monetary effects can be reflected in that. So, for example, if your health is better, then you're willing to pay for that, right? If a policy improves your health, you'll have a positive monetary equivalent. If it reduces your mortality risk or improves the environment, again, that could be reflected in the monetary equivalent. So non-market effects are reflected in these monetary equivalents. Indeed, there's a whole sophisticated literature that tries to estimate those. But CBA is limited in a couple of critical ways. One is CBA is insensitive to the distribution of monetary equivalents, right? So it doesn't matter whether the person benefiting is rich or poor, right? A policy that has a certain sum total of positive equivalents and a certain sum total of negative equivalence is seen the same way, whether or not all the benefits go to the rich and the costs go to the poor, or vice versa, right? So it's totally insensitive to the distribution of money or monetary equivalents. A related point is that CBA, at least textbook CBA, is biased towards the rich, right? It's biased toward the rich, right? People who have more money tend to spend more for non-market goods, right? If I'm wealthy, I'm going to pay more for environmental quality or for risk reduction than if I'm poor, right? The so-called VSL, the value of statistical life, right, which is kind of your willingness to pay for a unit of risk reduction, right? If you actually calculate that accurately, increases with income, right? So that means that if government did textbook CBA, it would be willing to spend more to produce risk reductions for the rich than for the poor. It would be willing to do more to produce health improvements for the rich than for the poor. That is politically controversial, right? So in practice, government doesn't do that. What it does is to use population average monetary equivalence, right? So, you know, OIRA, sort of the cost-benefit oversight department in the US government, says we're going to value a risk reduction at the very same amount, regardless of whether that benefits someone who is rich or poor. But that itself creates difficulty. So, for example, if lower income people not just benefit from the risk reduction, but bear the costs, right? The cost may be reflected in increased prices. We may be putting in place risk reductions which have greater costs than they're willing to bear. All right, so that's the problems. I mean, these are very important techniques, but they're also limited. And so one of the things the handbook wants to do is to move beyond them, right? And this is not, we're not the first to think about this. This has been out there in discourse for a while, but the handbook is trying to sort of develop policy frameworks that move beyond GDP and CBA. All right, so one way to do that, right, my preferred way to do that is this notion of the social welfare function. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit, and then I'll talk about how this is kind of one of the pervasive themes in the handbook. So the social welfare function sees each outcome, right? An outcome is a possible consequence, right? What might happen as a result of policy, right? So an outcome, in effect, is a possible allocation of different attributes among the population of interest, right? It tells us, you know, how much income different people or different groups get, what their health is, what their expected longevity is, and so forth, right? So the idea of the social welfare function is to see any given outcome as a pattern of individual well-being, right? And we're going to try to do that numerically. We're going to have a well-being measure, right? And so we take a given outcome, X, and we're going to convert that into a list of well-being numbers, right? We're going to take all the information about how individuals might do in that given outcome and try to summarize that in a list of well-being numbers, right? So W1X there is simply the well-being of individual one in outcome X. Of course, we're not going to literally do this individual by individual. We'll think about individuals as members of groups, but this is the underlying theory. Once we've done that, various rules can be used to compare outcomes, right? So the utilitarian social welfare function, an idea that goes back, of course, to Jeremy Bentham, simply says you just add up well-being numbers, right? You compare outcomes understood as patterns of well-being by just adding up well-being numbers. A prioritarian social welfare function, rather than adding up well-being numbers, adds up well-being numbers plugged into a transformation function, right? The effect of that is to give greater weight to those who are worse off, right? So instead of just adding up numbers, these well-being numbers, we add up well-being numbers plugged into this kind of function, right? The effect of that's going to be that we give greater weight, right? The value here is going to be bigger for a well-being hit that affects someone who is worse off than is someone who is better off. This idea of the social welfare function is principally a policy assessment tool. I'll say in a second, I'll mention the different literatures where it's used, right? Because again, a given policy, regulation, an infrastructure project, a spending program, any kind of governmental policy can be seen either as an outcome, right? If we're certain then each policy will produce for certain a given outcome. Realistically, we're not going to know that, but at least we might think about policy as a probability distribution across outcomes, right? And we're going to have, using this idea of the social welfare function, will rank policies as a function of the different possible outcomes and their probabilities. And so this, assuming we can do it, right, this is straightforwardly an approach for policy assessment. It can also be used as a replacement for a supplement to GDP as an indicator of societal condition, right? We can look at kind of the annual flow of income and other attributes and think about the social welfare that results from that. Now, the critical thing about this is that unlike CBA, both the utilitarian social welfare function and the prioritarian social welfare functions, or more specifically prioritarian social welfare functions, right? Because utilitarianism simply adds up well-being numbers. This is just one way to rank the outcomes. Prioritarianism is a whole family, right? It takes curves like this, and the more concave this is, the greater priority to the worse off. So really, it's a whole family of social welfare functions. But both of these kinds of social welfare functions are sensitive to distribution, right? This is a critical difference from cost-benefit analysis, right? The utilitarian social welfare function in equity or distribution, right, is sensitive to the diminishing marginal well-being effect of income, right? So giving a unit of income to someone at low income, right, has bigger utility, makes a bigger bump to well-being than giving the unit of income to someone at higher income, right? And utilitarianism is sensitive to that, right? Utilitarianism prefers to give a unit of income, ceteris paribus, right, if nothing else changes, to someone with lower income as opposed to someone with higher income. Prioritarianism is sensitive to the diminishing marginal well-being effect of income, but beyond that, it has a generalized preference for the equalization of well-being, right? So if you can imagine two outcomes with the same total well-being, right? In one of that, the outcomes well-being is distributed unequally. In the other outcome, it's distributed equally. Utilitarianism is indifferent to the two, right? Utilitarianism simply says all we care about is the sum total. Prioritarianism says, we actually, prefer to equalize well-being. We prefer an equal distribution of a given total amount of well-being to an unequal distribution. One way to think about that is imagine a change in someone's attributes that can benefit someone who is well off or someone who is badly off, but produces the same change in well-being, right? So, for example, we might think that whether you're rich or you're poor, a change in your health, right, produces the same change in your well-being, right? So utilitarianism then will be indifferent to whether the health improvement benefits someone who is rich or someone who is poor, while prioritarianism will prefer the health improvement to benefit the poor person, ceteris paribus, because it gives priority to well-being changes affecting the worse off. Okay. One other thing to note here, I mean, it's, I'm kind of a middle-of-the-road guy, so I like equity, but I also like efficiency, the Pareto principle, right? The Pareto principle, which is the way that economists think about efficiency, is this notion that if we can make some people better off and harm no one, that's a good thing. I think that's great. I love the Pareto principle. But there's no inconsistency between the Pareto principle and principles of equity, right? And what is cost-benefit analysis respects the Pareto principle but does not care for equity, either in terms of the distribution of income or in terms of the distribution of well-being, while both the utilitarian and prioritarian social welfare functions respect the Pareto principle, but they also take account of equity. So they hybridize these two, it seems to me, very important concerns in terms of policies. This is just kind of an axiomatic presentation. If we think of these as kind of well-being numbers, Pareto superiority, so this 4 people, obviously kind of a hypothetical case, 4 people. Pareto superiority says if you take that 4th person there and move her from 12 to 13, that's an improvement. Anonymity says if you take well-being numbers and just reorder them, that should make no difference. Separability says if we have some people who are unaffected, it doesn't matter what their well-being levels are. Continuity says small changes don't make a big difference. Pagoo-Dalton, so the thing to understand here is that Pareto superiority, anonymity, which is kind of neutrality as to which particular people get well-being, right? If we have a given pattern of well-being and we rearrange that, that itself should not make an ethical difference. Utilitarianism satisfies all of these except for Pagoo-Dalton. Pagoo-Dalton is the equity and well-being axiom, right? Prioritarianism satisfies all the axioms here that utilitarianism satisfies, but also satisfies Pagoo-Dalton, right? So if we think here, I don't have a pointer here, but if we think here, right, the sum total here, we've taken 2 units of well-being from someone who is worse off. 2 units of well-being from someone who is better off, right? He has moved down from 10 to 8. She has moved up from 4 to 6. Total well-being does not change. So utilitarianism is just indifferent, right? The sum total is the same, but prioritarianism prefers the equalization. All right, that's the theory in, what, 3 minutes. So if you want to know more, read the handbook or read my prior books or take my class. But let me say, I'm happy to say I didn't make this up. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here. Social welfare functions are widely used in various economic literatures. Theoretical welfare economics, but also more applied literature. So-called optimal tax theory tries to figure out how should we sort of design the tax system to both maximize social welfare, either in the utilitarian sense or the prioritarian sense, but also take account of incentives, right? And that is done, that's a difficult set of trade-offs, and that is done in the literature through social welfare functions. Climate economics, right, the so-called social cost of carbon, right? We're trying to decide what are the trade-offs between reducing damage to future generations and reducing income or consumption for the present generation. To make that trade-off, you really need a social welfare function, right? And that's how it's done in the literature, environmental economics, growth and development. So as I said, I'm plugging my prior work here. I've got a very long book, not as long as this book, but a long book, Well-Being and Fair Distribution, exploring the idea of the social welfare function, and a forthcoming, I hope, certainly shorter and I hope more accessible book on the same topic. All right, so it's not the only theme, but it's a central theme in the handbook, right? Many different chapters explore this notion of the social welfare function, right? And this is something which is not yet used in government, but let's wait, right? It is a pervasive tool in scholarship, and the hope here is to further that development. Cost-benefit analysis, it turns out that if you do cost-benefit analysis, not just summing up monetary equivalents, but using so-called distributional weights, right? So these are weighting factors which are bigger for those who have lower income. That is a way to approximate a social welfare function, right? And Robin Bodway, who is truly a world-class economist, in his chapter on cost-benefit analysis in the handbook, talks at great depth about that. Inequality measures, right? So a prioritarian social welfare function can be represented as a combination of total well-being and a concern for the inequality of well-being, right? So inequality measures are related to social welfare functions. There's, of course, a chapter on social welfare functions. There's something called social ordering functions, which is a related idea. A chapter on happiness-based policy analysis seeks to measure well-being, not in terms of preferences, but in terms of happiness, and to feed that into a social welfare function. Social evaluation, how do you apply a social welfare function under uncertainty, right? This turns out to be tricky. So are you going to apply the social welfare function in an ex-ante measure? That is to say, are you concerned with the distribution of expected well-being or with the expected distribution of realized well-being? The distribution of expected well-being or the expected distribution of realized well-being, right? Expected inequality or expected realized inequality. These are not the same thing. These are not the same thing. And so the chapter on risk and uncertainty talks about that. Individual responsibility, how might you refine a social welfare function to take account of uncertainty. The authors there, Chico Ferraro and Vito Perugine. Chico's at the World Bank and is a pioneer. The World Bank actually does this in terms of their measures, and so they have a great chapter there, lifetime well-being and future generations. All right, I know you came into the room here for two reasons, because lunch was offered and because you heard about happiness. So I haven't said much about happiness, so now I'm going to say a little bit about happiness. Right, this is a second theme in the handbook that I'm going to highlight, which is the nature of well-being. And let me say, this idea of the social welfare function is basically agnostic, at least in theory, about what exactly well-being is. It says whatever well-being is, let's measure it and let's plug it in. But it's up to you to tell us what well-being is. Now, it turns out that the nature of well-being is contested, right? There are three distinct families of views that are represented in the contemporary philosophical literature, each of which has deep historical roots, right? So one of these is the preference view that says basically what's good for me is what I want, is getting what I want, right? My well-being depends upon the satisfaction of my preferences, right? The idea there is that my well-being is about me, right? So certainly my perspective should matter, right? It should be what I want. Now, of course, my actual preferences might be kind of screwed up, and so, there are refinements of this view that talk about my fully informed preferences, my rational preferences, and so forth. The second type of view, I'm going to call a mental state view, right? The paradigm of that is hedonism, which says your well-being just depends upon what goes on in your head, right? So hedonism, again, the paradigm of that says your well-being depends just upon your pains and pleasures. This goes back to Bentham. Now, sometimes it's not really clear about how this view is different from a preference view, but if you reflect upon the fact that people can prefer things other than their own happiness, you can see that they're different, right? Lots of people have goals, right? Different things they want to accomplish with their life, lots of different kinds of things. And what they want is to accomplish that. They don't want just to have certain beliefs about that. They actually want to accomplish that. And they may want to accomplish that even though that may not be the best way to maximize their well-being. I mean, that's the way I feel about teaching and scholarship. Right? I want to actually be a good teacher and scholar. I don't want to actually just think that I'm a good teacher and scholarship, right? I mean, if my students are complaining about me behind my back, I care about that, right? Further, I mean, I like it, but if I were sitting down and trying to figure out what is the way to maximize my pleasure of my lifetime, I'm not sure that would be that. I'm not doing it to maximize my pleasure and happiness. I'm doing it because that's the kind of life I want to lead. So these are not the same things, but there is a tradition, certainly in philosophy, that thinks about well-being in terms of the mental states, either pains and pleasures or some package of mental states. In terms of how these views are reflected in current scholarship, the preference view is sort of the standard view in welfare economics. Right? This is the cornerstone of welfare economics, right? Improving someone's well-being is a matter of satisfying her preferences. So-called utility functions, which again are a cornerstone of economics, are measures of preferences. But there is this now very large sort of revisionary branch of economics, happiness economics, right, that focuses not on preferences but on so-called subjective well-being. Right? This part of economics focuses on well-being as measured by surveys, either surveys that ask people how happy they are or how satisfied they are with their lives, right? Or perhaps other things. So, for example, surveys that measure affects, like are you sad, are you anxious, are you angry, are you enjoying yourself, right? But measuring one or another type of mental state, right? And there's a big literature in economics, so-called subjective well-being, right? Well-being understood as what goes on in your head, right, as opposed to realizing your preferences, which is very important now. Objective goods, this is a view that goes back to Aristotle, which says, things can be good for you other than your pains and pleasures, and indeed can be good for you even if they don't realize your preferences. And there's a whole big philosophical literature on that, and this is represented in policy, in a lot of policy work, inspired by Marc and Martha Nussbaum on so-called capabilities. Right? These are lists of goods which are posited as being good for people, whether or not they prefer them, and goods that transcend their mental states. Now, you might wonder, so how do we identify these things, right? I'm not going to take too much time on this, but you know, John Finnis, the Oxford philosopher, says the list of objective goods is life, knowledge, play, aesthetic experience, sociability, practical reasonableness, and religion. Nussbaum has a different list: life, bodily health, bodily integrity, the senses, imagination and thought, emotions, practical reason, affiliation, other species, play, control over one's environment. How do we come up with these? Well, I mean, one way to think about these typically, I mean, Finnis says, well, I just know, they're self-evident. I think a more defensible approach is to say that typically, and I think, you know, Sen and Nussbaum talk about this, is these are matters for deliberation. People collectively deliberate about what they view as being the good life. So you could view these as kind of flowing from collective preferences as opposed to each individual's preference. So in that understanding, they're related to a preference view, but still they represent collective deliberation as opposed to each person's preference about her own life. Okay, so there's the handbook covers, a lot of the handbook is about this. There are, as I already said, chapters that review and synthesize philosophical scholarship regarding each approach, chapters specifically about subjective well-being, the underlying scales, right? The surveys originate in psychology and now are used in economics. So there are separate chapters reviewing that, chapters about measurement, and then an empirical comparison. All right, does this matter? Doesn't matter. I mean, I love to theorize, but does it actually matter whether we think about well-being in terms of preferences, subjective well-being, that is mental states, or objective goods? The aim of the handbook is to provide firm theoretical foundations for policy assessment, right, rather than to survey the application of different frameworks to specific policy arenas. Maybe that'll be the next handbook, right? That said, I think it is quite clear from the literature on subjective well-being that subjective well-being-based policy would be quite different, would differ significantly from policy oriented to preferences or objective goods. So a pioneer in this literature, Richard Easterlin, documented this paradox that increasing income doesn't seem to lead to increasing happiness. He looked at increasing income in a given country over time, at comparisons across countries, and comparisons within a country. Now, the extent to which that's true, you know, has been sort of disputed empirically, but I think it seems to be true. I think there's consensus that at least above a certain level of income, subsistence or sort of middle income, there's only a weak correlation between income and happiness, right? That has big policy implications, right? If you care about preferences, income is, as John Rawls put it, an all-purpose good, right? Income is a good thing. It's a way to realize a lot of different preferences, right? It's not the only thing. It's not the, you know, the end-all, but it's an all-purpose resource for preferences. If you care about happiness, then again, beyond a certain point, giving people more income may not make a difference. There's a big literature that talks about adaptation, right? It seems like people can adapt to a lot of bad health conditions, right? It's hard to adapt to conditions that involve pain or that are uncertain, right? But lots of other health conditions, so paraplegia, for example, or other kinds of chronic, certain, not painful conditions that people adapt to, right? Such that their happiness is actually not much lower. So that would suggest that a happiness-oriented set of policies might focus less on producing health improvements, right? Because they don't make a big difference to happiness. On the other hand, people have a strong preference for health, right? In terms of choosing between types of health programs, right? I mean, not surprisingly, right? Mental health, right? Various kinds of mental health conditions have a terrible effect on happiness, right? That's almost analytic, right? So it might be that if we're sort of orienting policy towards happiness as opposed to preferences, we'd focus more on mental health as opposed to physical health. We do have, and this is really one of the best chapters in the handbook, I think, and it shows that both how to apply these different approaches empirically and that they matter. So Kundekank and Dirk Newman, Belgian and German young economists, great guys. There's something called the SUP, the Socioeconomic Panel, which is a huge survey of Germans. I think there's something like 15,000 people who were surveyed. It's an annual survey about lots of different things. Lots of different, their income, their employment status, other demographic attributes, how happy they are, and so forth. And de Konck and Newman in this chapter used the data from that survey to calculate well-being according to 5 different approaches, right? Income, an objective index, life satisfaction, how satisfied people, so one of the things that respondents were asked was how satisfied they are, and 2 different measures that looked at people's preferences. And then what they did is they said, who are the worst off? What is the worst off 10% of this big group according to the different well-being measures? And they find significant differences, right? So the objective income, the objective index is a combination of the person's income. They had data about a person's income, employment status, and health. And not surprisingly, because employment is weighted significantly in that index, the worst off, according to the objective index, tend to be unemployed. If we look at the worst off in terms of life satisfaction, who are the worst off in terms of their kind of expressed happiness, it's kind of remarkable that the worst off, the average income of this worst off decile is nearly the same as the average income of the whole population, right? Again, sort of consistent with the Easterlin point. But they're likelier to feel sad and to have a low sense of control over their lives. So these dispositional characteristics, right, dispositionally unhappy tend to pull down life satisfaction. In terms of the preference measures, in my chapter in the handbook develops, I'm a preference person, a preference-based approach to measuring well-being. If you look at the worst off according to the preference measure, as well as a different kind of preference measure that Marc Fleurbaey in his chapter develops, a large percentage of the worst off are in poor health. That reflects the fact that people have strong preferences for health. Right? People want to be healthy, independent of whether being healthy makes them happy. Right? So this actually does make a difference, again, consistently with what one would expect from the existing literature. All right, so because I want to get to questions, but in 2 or 3 minutes, I'm going to say 2 things. One about to make good on my promise earlier to explain what this horrible acronym IMWB means, and then to say something about, as my professor Owen Fisk at Yale Law School used to say, why bother? But let me first say about IMWB. The social welfare function, as I've described it, and as I've talked about, the measurement of well-being is structured around an inclusive measure of well-being. That is to say, at the level of each individual, or again, at the level of each group of individuals, if we think about individuals in terms of their characteristics, but in theory, at the level of each individual, we aggregate over the attributes at the individual level. So we look at each individual's well-being as a function of her income and her health and her longevity and so forth. We summarize that in an individual well-being number, right, using one or another measure of well-being, whether it's based on preferences, right, or mental states or objective goods. And then we assess policy in terms of the distribution of individual well-being numbers, right? So attributes are aggregated over at the individual level, and then we assess policy in terms of the pattern of individual well-being. But that approach can be contested and so-called multidimensional. Now, again, the term is confusing because the social welfare function is also multidimensional. Because again, we aggregate over the different dimensions of well-being at the individual level. But there are multidimensional approaches which are different. Now, the simplest way to do this is through a so-called dashboard, right? Let's imagine that we have, a bunch of different dimensions of individual flourishing. So we look at income, we look at education, we look at longevity, we look at health, we look at environmental condition and so forth. And we can then see how governmental policy, what the effect of governmental policy is on each dimension. Right, and that's governments often do that. The OECD does that. That can be useful. The problem with that is that's insensitive to interdimensional correlation, right? So imagine that those who are, so for example, what you might do is look, for every dimension, look at the total amount and the inequality. So the total amount of income and the inequality of income, the total amount of health and the inequality of health. That's one way to do it. But that ignores the fact that, for example, those who are badly off in terms of income might also be badly off in terms of health, right? So ideally, we want to look not just dimension by dimension, but at correlations. So there are actually sophisticated multidimensional policy indicators that are not structured around an inclusive measure of well-being. So the social welfare function approach does take account of how well each person is doing on all the dimensions. It's actually possible to do that, but without using this individual level well-being measure. The best example of that is the so-called multidimensional poverty metric that's used by the UN, and that's developed by Sabina Alkir and James Foster, and we were fortunate enough to get Alkir to write a chapter in the handbook. All right, why bother? So the handbook surveys, synthesizes, and refines academic methodologies for evaluating governmental policy and assessing social condition. What's the actual policy impact? Well, in general, one can point to at least 3 different kinds of impacts, right? The various methodologies can be used in academic studies, which in turn influence public debate. The methodologies are used directly by various NGOs. So, for example, the World Bank, the UN, OECD uses various of these methodologies. And of course, they can be used within government. And here I should stress the choice of methodology, the choice of approach to thinking about well-being, the choice of measure, the choice of parameter, that has got to be made by democratically accountable policymakers. So these are, in a sense, technocratic tools, but in order for them to be legitimately adopted in government, that's got to be done by democratically accountable policymakers. So think about cost-benefit analysis. That comes in because in the US, because every president since Reagan has said, I like that, right? And to the extent that we're going to shift to, for example, social welfare functions, that would have to be through the democratic process. So these are kind of theoretical channels for influence. In the current political moment, with public debate fueled by anger, fear, resentment, and outrage, much of it justified, an academic discussion of policy methodology may seem utopian and out of touch. But I think if you look at the history of GDP and CBA, these things which are now really pervasive to policy conversations, governmental practice, they both originate and work by academics, right? So, GDP arises as a response to the Great Depression, right? As academics realize that we need better tools for measuring what's actually going on in countries' economies, right? So Kuznets and Keynes are pioneers in terms of developing GDP. Cost-benefit analysis goes back to a French engineer, Dupuy, and then was pushed along by British academics, Cowder and Hicks, and many others. And I think the history of those shows that scholarly efforts to develop better policy tools can have a huge payoff, if not immediately, then in the longer run. Thank you.
So I don't know whether or not we're going to be able to solve in 5 minutes empirically the issue of well-being, but we'd like to open up the floor for questions.
I love this, I always have. And thinking about in terms of policy, the approach is to understand individual well-being and then aggregate across a population. And I wonder if we're missing something by not thinking about communities. So we think about not only communities being the source of both economic and social well-being for individuals, but also a really important instrument in achieving policies. We have healthy communities, we might have healthy individuals. That might be a better way to think through policy.
Right, right. No, absolutely. So 2 points. So one is that the attributes that feed into individual well-being might include relational attributes, right? So for example, what my social cohesion is like, right? Or what my relative income is might influence my well-being. Often economists say, well, no, to simplify by saying my well-being is just a function of my own income, my own health, longevity, but that's way too simple. And let me say, by the way, although I don't think that happiness is the total measure, I think happiness can be an input into well-being, and happiness in turn is obviously improved by social cohesion. The other thing is in terms of policy, I mean, policies to build community can be good policies to increase social welfare. So in those two ways, you know, it's in here. And as these are used in more sophisticated ways, they will take account of communities. Neil.
So I wonder whether the reason CBA and GDP are used and not SWF is not simply because they came first, but because notwithstanding all of their problems, they're easier to do. There are distributional problems, there are problems with measuring, but you still know what you're measuring, whereas here you're pointing out fundamental disagreement about what well-being entails. Is it subjective? Is it objective? Is it preference-based? And I don't know that we're going to persuade one another, right? That I'm right and you're wrong. You're preference-based. It's completely intuitive to me why people could have a lot of money and get what they want and be very unhappy, right? So how do you expect the social welfare approach to be adopted by government when there's so much basic fundamental disagreement about what human welfare is about?
So thank you. I mean, there are really two different points. One is complexity. So let me say, I mean, if you actually look at how GDP is calculated, it's incredibly complex. I mean, there's a whole system of national accounts that has to be set up to do that. Or the analogy I make is risk. I mean, part of the reason the EPA has been so successful is because Ruckelshaus comes in as secretary in the 1970s and says, we're going to put in place systematic and very complicated techniques for risk assessment. The UK, which likes happiness, has now put in place methodologies for assessing happiness, right? So if you want to measure it, you can do it. But the other point is that it involves normative choices, and that's right. But by the way, so does CBA, right? So CBA thinks about well-being in terms of preferences as opposed to objective goods or happiness, right? So CBA measures monetary equivalence in terms of preferences, and it makes a normative choice that we are indifferent to the distribution of those. I mean, that is a very contestable normative choice. Who made that? Well, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, both Bushes, Obama, and Trump. So I agree with you. I mean, it's not, Matt Adler doesn't get to say, the U.S. should use social welfare function. I tried to persuade the Obama, OIRA to incorporate distributional weights that would make cost benefit closer to a social welfare function, and they didn't do it. Who knows what happens in 2021? Arden.
How do you know whose well-being should be incorporated into policy assessment? Are you just content to leave that up to a democratically accountable policymakers? Even if so, then might we still not need specific measurement methodologies for particular types of people, for future people versus current people, or foreign versus domestic, or non-human animals versus people animals, children, mentally ill, etc.?
Yeah, no, I mean, so again, there's the approach assumes that there's a population of ethical concern, right? And what that population is up to the policymaker. I mean, I think as an ethical matter, that population is everyone. Everyone who existed, currently exists and will exist, right? From the ancient Romans to us now here in the room to the people in the 25th century. They're all people. And by the way, another, which we don't talk about, but a big issue now in scholarship on social welfare functions is animals. Huge issue, right? And this is interesting because there's a longstanding literature on animal rights, but for welfarists, right, there's a similar issue. Should animals be incorporated? Animals are not taken account of in cost-benefit analysis, right, at least directly. Insofar as people care about animals, right, they're incorporated, but animals are not themselves independent units. And, whether they should be, and if so, which animals, that too is a matter for ethical discussion, and ultimately for democratic discussion.
If there are no further questions, I'd like to again thank Professor Adler for his presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.